August 19th, 1984. Manassas, Virginia. At around 4:15 a.m., the doorbell rings at the residence of 31-year-old Virginia State Police Trooper Johnny Bowman. When Johnny answers the door, he is viciously attacked by an assailant who stabs him over 40 times before fleeing the scene, and they leave behind a wig, glasses, and hard hat, which were possibly used as a disguise. Years later, investigators announced that Johnny may have been murdered by a fellow state trooper over a personal dispute, but there is not enough evidence to charge them, and the crime remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring the brutal death of a trooper from the Virginia State Police, the 1984 murder of Johnny Bowman. I received a request to cover this case a few years ago, and while I've done a couple of episodes about the unsolved murders of law enforcement officers, this is a particularly unique one which stands out from the rest. Johnny Bowman was not killed in the line of duty, but was viciously attacked inside his own home while his wife, daughter, and brother were present. At 4:15 in the morning, Johnny was awakened by the sound of a ringing doorbell, and when he answered the door, an assailant proceeded to stab him no less than 42 times before fleeing the scene. At the outset, the crime left everyone completely perplexed, as Johnny seemed to be a universally beloved and well-respected person who did not appear to have any known enemies, and his death became the subject of one of the largest law enforcement investigations in the history of Virginia. In a surprise turn of events, it was eventually announced that Perry Worrell, a fellow state trooper who also happened to be one of Johnny's closest friends, was the prime suspect in the murder. Details are vague, but the authorities seemed convinced that the crime was some sort of personal dispute, yet even though they made it sound like an arrest was imminent, it never came to fruition. As the years went by, it appeared that Perry Worrell was no longer the primary focus of the investigation, and there is now some question about whether the official version of events surrounding Johnny's death is actually the truth, and if perhaps multiple people might have been involved. Last summer, we passed the 40-year anniversary of the crime, which still gets coverage in the media from time to time, and since law enforcement has not given up on solving it, I thought now would be a good time to do an episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can gather access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Johnny Bowman. Our story begins in 1984 in Manassas, Virginia, a town located in Prince William County about 30 miles from Washington, D.C., which had a population of around 20,000 at that time. Our central figure is 31-year-old Johnny Rush Bowman, who was born in Pulaski County and was one of 3 sons to parents Rush and Dawn Bowman. After growing up in the town of Dublin, Johnny served 6 years in the United States Marine Corps and attained the rank of E5 Sergeant before he was honorably discharged. Johnny then decided to join the Virginia State Police, and at this particular point, He has been a state trooper for 5 years and works at the Independent Hill substation. Johnny and his wife Terry Bowman have been married for 3 years and have a 2-year-old daughter, Ashley Nicole Bowman, who goes by the name Nikki. The family currently lives in a 2-story townhouse on Patterson Street in the Bristow Station subdivision, and Johnny is a universally beloved and respected member of the community. Since he is an avid weightlifter who stands 6'2" and weighs 180 pounds, he has earned the nickname Big John. On August the 18th, Johnny worked a double shift patrolling a local fair and a highway truck weighing station before he returned home. Since he had another patrol scheduled at the fair at 7 a.m. the following morning, Johnny went to sleep early, and his daughter Nikki asked if she could join him in his bed. That evening, Terry Bowman was being visited at the residence by her friend Melanie Worrell, whose husband, Perry Worrell, also happened to be a Virginia State Trooper and one of Johnny's closest friends. In addition, Johnny's younger brother, Bobby Bowman, and his sister-in-law, Doris Bowman, were both spending the night at the residence, marking the first time that Bobby had gotten the opportunity to stay there since Johnny got married. After Terry drove Melanie Worrell back to her own residence and returned home, she decided to sleep on the downstairs couch in order not to wake up her husband or her daughter. Well, at around 4:15 a.m. on the morning of August the 19th, Terry said that she was woken up by the sound of a ringing doorbell. She went to the window and briefly looked outside, but claimed she saw nothing, so she returned to the couch in order to fall back asleep. However, the doorbell soon rang again, but since Terry could hear the sound of Johnny coming downstairs to answer it, she decided to remain on the couch. Shortly thereafter, Terry thought she heard the voice of someone uttering an obscenity from behind the front door, as they apparently said, quote, "I'm from the bleeping power company." The door was then opened, and Terry heard what sounded like a violent commotion. When she glanced into the foyer next to the front door, she saw what she later described as shadows in the darkness. When she realized that Johnny was being attacked by an assailant, she called upstairs by yelling, quote, "Bobby, help! Bobby, help!" Bobby and Doris Bowman were sleeping in an upstairs bedroom until they were awakened by Terry screaming. When Bobby ran to the staircase, he saw a figure standing over Johnny in the foyer, so he yelled at this person to get off his brother. The assailant headed for the front door, but when Bobby went downstairs after them, he wound up slipping on a pool of blood. The momentum caused him to collide with the assailant until they both wound up outside, but after a brief struggle, the assailant got to their feet and ran off. While Bobby briefly attempted to pursue this figure, they wound up getting away. By this point, Terry had already called 911 for help, and she discovered that Johnny had been viciously stabbed several times, as the walls, floor, and ceiling of the foyer were now covered in blood. Police and paramedics soon arrived at the scene, and since Johnny was still alive at this point, he was immediately rushed to Prince William Hospital, but wound up passing away around 45 minutes later. The frenzied attack on Johnny in the foyer had lasted just under 3 minutes, and it would turn out that he was stabbed a total of 42 times in the face, chest, stomach, shoulder, neck, and throat. After his pulmonary artery was severed, Johnny had collapsed to the floor, but the attacker continued to stab him in his legs and his side while he was lying in a fetal position. W.T. Poindexter, an investigator who photographed the murder scene, would later provide this description of it during an interview, quote, "You want to know what it was like? If you can imagine being able to take pure, unadulterated rage out of a paper bag and throw it into a 4 or 5 foot square area and locking the door for 5 minutes, that's what the scene was like. That's what stays with me to this day." End quote. Since it was dark, Terry said that she was unable to get a good look at the attacker's face to provide a description, and while she briefly heard this person's voice from behind the front door, she couldn't be certain if it was a man or a woman. But while Bobby did not get a clear look at the killer either, he described him as being a husky black man with a round face who appeared to be around 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 180 pounds. A brown curly wig, a pair of non-prescription aviator eyeglasses with black metal rims, and a construction hard hat were discovered at the scene, as the perpetrator may have used these items to disguise themselves. This particular brand of hard hat was ordinarily worn by electricians, and it had green plastic marking tape with the numeral 1 on it, as well as an orange price tag for $6. Investigators would later determine that the hat was a Norton Model 69, originally manufactured in Georgia in 1979, before it was acquired by the Aberdeen Proving Ground, a U.S. Army facility in Maryland. It eventually wound up at an establishment in Baltimore called H&H Surplus and Campers Haven, where it was likely purchased by the killer. Bloody shoe prints were also found on the sidewalk and an adjacent parking lot to the Bowman residence, and while the murder weapon was never recovered, investigators believed that it was likely a folding knife with a 4-inch blade. This marked the first time that an American state trooper had been murdered since 1976, and the crime was all the more unusual since Johnny was off duty at the time and killed in his own home. At the time of his death, Johnny was dressed in a t-shirt, athletic shorts, and sneakers, but his loved ones found it surprising that he did not carry a gun or another weapon as protection when he answered the front door, given that it was 4:15 in the morning. Since Johnny's marked patrol car was parked in plain view in front of his house, the killer likely would have known that a police officer lived there, so this led to speculation that Johnny was specifically targeted and not just the victim of a random crime. But since he had a clean work record and was such a beloved figure in the community, no one could figure out who would have had a motive to kill him. Katie Bolton, the wife of another state trooper, told the press, quote, "Johnny was not just a state trooper. Johnny was a kind man. No, kind isn't it. He was more than that. The best way to describe Johnny is that people could not like him. There was nothing about him not to like." End quote. On August the 21st, Johnny was laid to rest at Highland Memory Gardens in his original hometown of Dublin, and his funeral service was attended by between 1,200 to 400 people, hundreds of whom were Virginia state troopers and other law enforcement officers. In the span of only 2 days following the murder, the community had rallied together to raise a $1,000 reward for information, and over the course of the next few years, Prince William crime solvers would keep gradually raising the reward and receive so many contributions that the amount eventually reached $28,000, the largest reward ever amassed in Prince William County at that time. Johnny's murder led to one of the most extensive investigations in the history of Virginia, as a task force was assembled consisting of such law enforcement agencies as the Virginia State Police, the Manassas City Police Department, and the Prince William County Commonwealth Attorney's Office. The FBI even assisted with the investigation and constructed a criminal profile for the assailant, in which they predicted that he would likely kill again. Around 20 hand-picked agents would work rotational 12-hour shifts, in which they interviewed over 3,000 people in 41 different states and checked out more than 1,600 leads. This included checking out the records of Johnny's arrests and traffic citations during his time with the state police to see if anyone might have been motivated to seek revenge on him, but this angle failed to turn up any potential suspects. Terry and her daughter Nikki could no longer continue living in their townhouse following Johnny's murder and relocated to a home in a different subdivision in Manassas. In an ironic turn of events, the townhouse wound up being purchased by a United Airlines pilot whom Johnny had once pulled over for driving under the influence. Rather than arrest the pilot, Johnny elected to let him off with a warning and drive him home, so he decided to repay the favor by purchasing Johnny's house, since he knew his family would probably have a hard time selling it. For 2 years, Johnny's murder continued to remain unsolved, but in August of 1986, Chief State Police Investigator Robert Martin and Prince William County Commonwealth's Attorney Paul Ebert publicly announced that they had a prime suspect and they believed an arrest was imminent. While they declined to name the suspect, they said he was a white male Virginia resident whom they were keeping under constant surveillance. Martin said that due to new information and evidence which had been gathered over the previous 2 months, he was now, quote-unquote, 99.4% certain this guy was the killer, and confirmed that he had been to the Bowman residence on previous occasions and had what was described as a, quote-unquote, high degree of familiarity and, quote-unquote, emotional involvement with both Johnny and Terry Bowman. Well, 3 months later, in November, law enforcement decided to publicly reveal the suspect's identity, and in a shocking turn of events, it turned out to be one of Johnny's closest friends and a fellow state trooper, 32-year-old Perry Worrell. Perry had served with Johnny in the Marines before joining the Virginia State Police in 1977. In fact, at Johnny's funeral service, Perry made this glowing statement about him to the press, quote, "He was the nicest person. I know everybody says that, but with Johnny, it was true. He was like a brother to me," end quote. However, only a few weeks after the murder, Perry was placed on unpaid administrative leave. He eventually left the state police and got a job with a towing company, but shortly before he was named as the prime suspect, Perry suffered a serious injury which left him unable to work. During one of his shifts, Perry had pulled over his wrecker to help a disabled car which was parked on the shoulder of an exit ramp off Interstate 95. When Perry was bent over to check the car's engine, another vehicle came barreling down the exit ramp after its driver fell asleep at the wheel. It wound up crashing into the rear of the disabled car, which caused Perry to become pinned between the car and his wrecker and left him badly injured. While details are vague, investigators stated that at the time of the murder, there appeared to be quote-unquote personal problems between Johnny, Perry, and Terry, which may have escalated into violence, though they clarified that this relationship was not a love triangle. An anonymous law enforcement source told the press that Perry was a quote-unquote walking time bomb during that time period, and following Johnny's death, Perry was described as being anxious and depressed and unable to cope with the situation. Even though the authorities had previously stated that an arrest was imminent, they ultimately decided against seeking a grand jury indictment against Perry because they did not believe they had sufficient evidence to get a conviction. While Perry recuperated from his injuries, he declined to speak to the media, but his attorney stated that Perry had nothing to do with the murder and was placed on administrative leave by the state police for medical reasons since he was left absolutely distraught by the loss of his friend. As you might recall, Perry's wife, Melanie Worrell, had spent the evening at the Bowman residence before Terry drove her home in the hours prior to the murder. Melanie provided her husband with an alibi, claiming they were both in bed together the entire night. Regardless, lead investigator Robert Martin still expressed his belief that Perry was the killer. There were rumors that the state police did not want to charge Perry with the crime because they feared it would look embarrassing if one of their troopers was convicted of killing another trooper, but Martin adamantly denied this, stating, quote, "I don't care whether he's a member of this department or any other department. Murder is murder. I'm not concerned about embarrassment to the department. We've always had a history of cleaning our own house," end quote. Another complication was that Bobby Bowman had described Johnny's attacker as being a black man, even though Perry was white. However, investigators were inclined to believe that Bobby was mistaken and figured that since it was dark inside the house and he was still a bit disoriented after just having woken up, Bobby got confused about the killer's race since the assailant had blood from Johnny's arterial spray on his face. Well, the promise of an imminent arrest never did materialize, and in January of 1989, Johnny's father, Rush Bowman, passed away of pneumonia at the age of 71. Later that year, his mother, Dawn Bowman, granted permission to have Johnny exhumed, as investigators wanted to re-examine his body for potential evidence that they might have missed the first time around. In particular, they were looking to see if any knife fragments were still embedded inside Johnny's body, but while they never found any, the authorities did say that they got some things which could have proved useful in the future. Investigators also revealed, while they still considered Perry Worrell to be the prime suspect, they were also exploring the possibility that more than one person was involved in the crime, as during her 911 call, Terry had supposedly said, quote, "They are killing my husband." When Dawn Bowman was interviewed, she expressed her belief that there was at least 3 people present when the crime took place, and her son was murdered because he knew incriminating information about his attackers. In fact, Dawn even stated that the initial reports about Johnny being attacked after answering his front door were, quote-unquote, completely untrue, as she believed the assailants were already inside the house before the stabbing occurred. In September of 1996, the case got some national exposure when it was featured on an episode of the TV series Real Stories of the Highway Patrol, but while they hoped this might help generate some new leads, it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. The episode featured an interview with Virginia State Police Senior Trooper Mark Wilkinson, who said that during the original investigation, he was assigned the task of going through every single traffic summons Johnny had ever written and tracking down and speaking to every person who received them to see if any of them stood out as a potential suspect. In August of 2004, a 20-year anniversary article was published about the case in the Manassas-based newspaper, The News and Messenger, and investigators revealed that Perry Worrell was no longer the primary focus of the investigation, though he was still considered to be a suspect. Terry Bowman, who had since remarried, was interviewed for the article and confirmed that she had not been completely ruled out as a suspect either. The article also contained the first interview with Johnny's daughter, Nikki Bowman, who was now 22 years old, and revealed that she was planning to major in criminal justice at George Mason University and hoped to follow in her father's footsteps by pursuing a career in law enforcement. In addition, Bobby Bowman recounted his memories of his brother's murder and still continued to insist that the attacker he saw was a black man. Sadly, only 7 months after the article was published, Bobby passed away at the age of 51 after battling a long illness, and his wife Doris would follow suit when she died in September of 2014 at the age of 58. In 2005, the Virginia State Police announced that they had launched another new task force and reopened the investigation, as this remained Virginia's only unsolved murder of a state trooper. In August of 2006, it was announced that a Fairfax man named Samuel Ray Case had been arrested and charged with obstruction of justice for interfering with the investigation. Case supposedly made an angry phone call to a special agent's department-issued cell phone and threatened to kill him because the agent had contacted his son-in-law and brother during the investigation. In spite of this, Case was not considered to be a suspect in Johnny's murder. In February of 2012, Don Bowman tragically passed away at the age of 79, but 6 months later, in August of that year, the FBI and the state police announced that they were now offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. While details were vague, investigators did reveal that DNA testing had been performed on some of the evidence, which allowed them to rule out a couple of persons of interest. However, it was never confirmed if one of these individuals was Perry Worrell, who would pass away in February of 2015 at the age of 59. In September of 2018, Nikki Bowman, who was now 36, did another interview in which she revealed that she was now working with the Manassas City Police Department. Since she was a family member, Nikki could not actively participate in the investigation into Johnny's murder, but she could still advocate for the case. While she had very few memories of her father, she spoke about how he was described as a kind, gentle man who would do anything for anyone. She confirmed that she never heard a bad word about him, which left her all the more baffled about why anyone would have wanted to murder him in such a brutal fashion. Nikki also continued to wonder if the official story about the circumstances of her father's death is actually the correct one, stating, quote, "There's just something off, which is why I feel the story that's out there is not actually what happened. That's why I need people who have overheard something, have been told something, or were there. I need them to come forward." End quote. Whatever the case, all we know is that after more than 40 years, the murder of Johnny Bowman continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So it's always surprising when the murder of a law enforcement officer goes unsolved for several years, as more often than not, the brothers in blue will go all out with trying to bring the perpetrator to justice. And it's particularly surprising for someone like Johnny Bowman, who appeared to be universally beloved by everyone who knew him, and no one had a bad word to say about him. I'll just go through the newspaper articles and read some of the original press coverage of this case, as it contains a ton of interview quotes from people who had nothing but glowing things to say about Johnny. Hell, I previously shared a glowing quote from none other than Perry Worrell, who was later accused of being the killer, so if Perry was guilty, he was putting up one hell of a facade to paint his victim in the best possible light. Manassas was not a town known for violent crime, as Johnny's homicide was the first one to take place there in 1984, and I'm sure no one predicted that they would be investigating the death of a state trooper who was stabbed to death at the front door of his own home. More often than not, when the murder of a law enforcement officer goes unsolved for a long time, there are allegations of corruption and incompetence within their department. But that does not appear to be the case here, as a task force was formed which involved the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies who seemed to go all out with trying to solve this crime. This was described as one of the most extensive investigations in the history of Virginia, as a lot of time and resources were spent trying to bring Johnny's killer to justice. And once Perry Worrell was publicly identified as the prime suspect a few years later, the authorities made it sound inevitable that he would be arrested, but this never took place. When the former lead investigator, Robert Martin, stated that he was 99.4% certain that Perry was the killer, I thought this was an oddly specific number, but I believe this was a reference to Ivory Soap, who had an advertising slogan about being 99.44% pure. Regardless, Martin and many of the other people involved in the investigation clarified that they didn't want to make an arrest unless they were 100% certain they could secure a conviction. So if their instincts about Perry Worrell were correct, it seems they may have been lacking that one final piece of evidence which would allow them to close the case. Perry passed away in 2015, so if he was guilty of the crime, he will never face justice for it. If new evidence surfaced, such as DNA, that conclusively linked Perry to the crime, I'm sure law enforcement would feel comfortable posthumously naming him as the killer. But at one point, they did state that even though Perry had not been ruled out as a suspect, he was no longer the focus of the investigation. So could it be possible that fresh eyes are now looking at this case in an entirely different light? We know that Johnny's daughter Nikki decided to follow in her father's footsteps by getting into law enforcement. When she was 31 years old, Nikki graduated from the police academy, which she found a bit poetic, since 31 was her father's age when he was killed. Obviously, Nikki will never be allowed to officially work on the investigation due to potential conflict of interest issues, but she has done a number of interviews over the years. Since she was only 2 years old when the crime took place, it's reasonable to assume that she has no memory of it, even though she was present when it happened. I have never heard Nikki state that she believes that Perry Worrell or anyone else was the killer, but she has made some rather cryptic remarks about how she is no longer certain that the official story of her father's death is what actually happened. And curiously enough, Johnny's mother, Dawn Bowman, made similar remarks before she passed away. That's all the more interesting when you consider that the source of the original story was Johnny's wife, Terry, and it appeared to be backed up by his brother Bobby and sister-in-law Doris. But let's go back to the very beginning and discuss how these alleged events unfolded. I'm always perturbed by cases in which someone literally shows up at the front door of a victim's residence to murder them for unknown reasons while their family is at home. A few months ago, I released an episode about the 2004 murder of Alistair Wilson, a seemingly ordinary family man from a small town in Scotland who was killed when an unidentified man shot him to death from his doorstep. But while firing a few shots into someone at their front door and fleeing the scene is one thing, going to the trouble of stabbing a victim 42 times in their own foyer at 4:15 in the morning is a whole other level of brazen. When you consider the fact that Terry was sleeping downstairs on the couch and Bobby was staying at the residence and attempted to intervene, it's a small miracle that the assailant was able to get away. I suppose it's not impossible that this was a thrill kill, as some psycho could have been passing through the area and picked out Johnny's house at random because they were in the mood to stab someone. But since Johnny's patrol car was parked in plain view outside, stopping at a police officer's residence to commit a crime like this would definitely be an odd choice. Anyway, when I first started researching this case, I initially found it odd that Terry was sleeping on the couch that night until I read how Nikki had asked to sleep in her father's bed, so Terry didn't want to disturb them or wake them up, since Johnny had to get up early to go on patrol. But it does make me wonder how this crime would be perceived if Terry had not been downstairs and was sleeping with her husband that night, as we technically only have her word about how the events surrounding Johnny's murder played out. To recap, Terry claimed that she was woken up by the doorbell ringing, but when she looked outside the window, she didn't see anyone, so she returned to the couch in order to fall back asleep. The doorbell then rang again, but since Terry heard Johnny coming downstairs to answer it, she didn't bother to move until she heard the sound of him being attacked in the foyer. Even though she said she caught a glimpse of Johnny's assailant, it was too dark to get a good enough look at his face to provide a description, though it is interesting that the prime suspect would later be identified as Perry Worrell, a man whom Terry definitely would have recognized. Now, if Terry's account is accurate, I am curious about how things might have played out if she had answered the door instead of Johnny, as the killer may not have known she was sleeping on the couch downstairs. As we saw in the Alistair Wilson case, his wife, Veronica, was the one who actually answered the door before Alistair was murdered, but even though the killer may have been thrown off by this, he did not seem concerned about eliminating Veronica as a witness since she said she did not recognize him. Here, if Terry answered the door and the killer was someone Johnny knew and would have been recognized by her, who knows how events would have played out. Even though there's been some questions about Terry's story, she's never been named as a suspect or person of interest, and I see no reason to believe that she was personally involved in her husband's murder, though it's worth noting that she was never officially ruled out as a suspect. Dawn Bowman once expressed her belief that Johnny may have been attacked by no less than 3 people, and some of them were already inside the house when her son supposedly went downstairs to answer the front door. Dawn never expanded upon why she believed this, and I don't know if she was attempting to question Terry's version of events, but Dawn's other son, Bobby, seemed to back up this story, since he described seeing a man viciously attacking Johnny in the foyer before he fled the scene. Bobby never described seeing multiple assailants, and I don't see why he would lie about his own brother's murder. Hell, by that point, Terry was already on the phone calling 911 for help, and it's been reported that Bobby could clearly be heard yelling, quote, "Hey, get away from my brother," in the background during the call's recording. If there were any inconsistencies in Terry or Bobby's stories, you might have to give them the benefit of the doubt, since they had just woken up and may have been half asleep and disoriented when they witnessed these events take place. So according to Terry, when Johnny opened the door, she heard someone utter an obscenity before they said they were from the power company. Since a hard hat was found at the scene, it is possible that the killer used it to disguise themselves as a power company worker, because what better way to convince someone to open the door at 4:15 in the morning than by pretending there's some sort of emergency? However, that ruse probably isn't going to work very well if you decide to use profanity and say you're from the quote-unquote bleeping power company. In spite of that, Johnny did open the door, and to this day, Nikki has always been puzzled about why her father did this. He went downstairs wearing nothing more than a t-shirt, shorts, and sneakers, and he was not carrying a gun or any other weapon for protection, which sounds very out of character for a police officer and former Marine who was hearing the doorbell ring at 4:15 a.m. while his family is at home. During her interview in 2018, Nikki stated, quote, "Now, being in the field myself, I would either answer the door with some sort of protection, or I'm not going to answer the door at all, or I'm going to call it in," end quote. I don't know if Johnny would have been able to see who was at the door from an upstairs window or something, but his willingness to open the door could indicate that he knew this person and did not feel threatened if he let them inside. Of course, since a hard hat, wig, and pair of glasses were found at the scene, this implies that the killer was wearing a disguise, which would likely make Johnny more suspicious and less inclined to open the door. However, we technically can't even be certain that the assailant had these items on when they committed the crime. Even though Terry and Bobby both said that they didn't get a clear look at the killer's face, it doesn't sound like either of them described this person as wearing a hard hat or eyeglasses, which they probably still would have noticed in the darkness. I don't know if this information has been intentionally withheld from the public, but from my research, it does not appear that law enforcement revealed the exact location where the wig, glasses, and hard hat were found. They only said these items were found at the scene, but never specified if they were inside the house, or on the doorstep, or on the front lawn, or elsewhere. It's been theorized that the killer may have never actually had any intention of wearing a disguise and only brought these items to stage the scene for the purposes of creating misdirection. Indeed, investigators spent a lot of time and energy trying to track these items and figure out where they came from, but this did not lead to the identification of a suspect. But while the idea of leaving random items at a crime scene to mislead investigators might not be something that your average criminal might dream up, would a police officer like Perry Worrell consider this idea? Well, even though I would love to speculate about the likelihood of Perry being the killer, law enforcement always seems to have been pretty cautious about revealing information about his potential involvement to the public. While the original investigators were pretty certain that Perry did this, we've only heard vague details about why. We know that Johnny and Perry had been close friends, while Terry was also close friends with Perry's wife, Melanie, but the authorities made cryptic statements about quote-unquote personal problems in the relationship between Johnny, Perry, and Terry. You could infer that someone may have been conducting an extramarital affair, but investigators made sure to confirm that the relationship was not a love triangle. What's interesting is that Melanie had been visiting the Bowman residence on the evening before the murder until Terry drove Melanie back to her place and then returned home to sleep on the couch. So if Perry was the killer, what could have driven him to travel to the Bowman residence hours later in order to stab Johnny 42 times? Prior to these events, Johnny had worked a double shift patrolling a local fair and a highway truck weighing station, but I haven't heard anything out of the ordinary occurring on these shifts, which might have compelled someone to kill Johnny after he returned home. It's obvious that law enforcement knows a lot more than they revealed, but given how confident they were about publicly naming Perry as a suspect 2 years after the fact, and making it sound like an arrest was imminent, you have to wonder what held them back from actually going through with it. They later said they declined to seek a grand jury indictment because they did not feel that the evidence was strong enough to secure a conviction, but what evidence did they have to begin with? We really don't know all that much about Perry as a person, but at the time, at least one anonymous source referred to him as a quote-unquote walking time bomb. Given that Johnny was stabbed over 40 times inside his own home, you have to think that if Perry did this, something must have gone horribly, horribly wrong with their relationship. Now, Melanie did provide Perry with an alibi that night and said they were in bed together, but even if you discount the possibility that Melanie was intentionally lying in order to protect her husband, was she still asleep during the time period the murder took place? Theoretically, if Perry left their house to commit the crime while Melanie was still sleeping and returned home before she woke up, would she have even realized it? We do know that Perry went on an unpaid leave of absence in the weeks following Johnny's murder before he left the state police altogether, but his attorney would claim that this was the result of him being distraught over the death of his best friend. Perry was injured in a serious accident in November of 1986, but I have no idea what his life was like until his death in 2015. There were rumors that Perry was never arrested because the Virginia State Police wanted to avoid the embarrassment of sending one of their own troopers to prison for murdering another trooper, but the investigation was performed by a joint task force consisting of multiple law enforcement agencies, and they made it very clear that they would not let anyone get away with an horrific crime like this, even if they were affiliated with law enforcement. And since Perry was no longer employed by the state police by the time he was named as a suspect, it would make no sense to orchestrate a cover-up for him. So when I consider the possible reasons why Perry was never arrested, I have to wonder if one of the deciding factors was the account from Bobby Bowman. As you recall, Bobby claimed the person he saw attacking Johnny was a black man, even though law enforcement seemed inclined to believe that the perpetrator was white, and that Bobby was mistaken about his race because it was dark, and the killer got Johnny's blood on his face. Of course, Perry Worrell was white, and even after he was named as a suspect years later, Bobby still continued to stick with his original story that the assailant was black. I'm sure there was probably fear that if Perry was charged with the murder and went to trial, Bobby's account might have been enough to generate reasonable doubt and secure an acquittal, particularly since he was the victim's brother and wouldn't have any reason to lie about what he saw or change his mind if law enforcement managed to convince him the killer was white. I certainly hope that the authorities were not wrong about this, because it's giving me flashbacks to my episode about the 1985 murder of Roger Dean, which I covered way back on episode number 128. In that particular case, a young girl saw the killer fleeing the murder scene from her bedroom window and described him as being black, but the authorities were convinced she was mistaken about his race because from the high angle she saw him from, a white man could have appeared to look black when running past some bright white snow in the background. For over 3 decades, the official narrative was that Roger Dean's killer was white, but in 2021, genetic genealogy wound up linking DNA evidence to a suspect named Michael Jefferson, and lo and behold, he turned out to be a black man, so the girl was right all along, and investigators spent over 35 years looking in the wrong direction. I'm really hoping that a similar mistake wasn't made in this case, and Perry Worrell wasn't falsely accused, but to be fair, there's also been speculation that multiple people committed this murder. Perhaps Perry was still involved, and Bobby happened to see a black accomplice attacking his brother, but if there were any black men from Johnny's personal life who would have had a motive to kill him, the authorities have never said so. Regardless, this whole discrepancy still bothers me. Of course, whenever a police officer is murdered, you always have to delve into their work background to see if they ever arrested or crossed paths with any individuals who wanted to come after them as revenge. Investigators did look into this angle, even going so far as to check the records of all the traffic summons Johnny ever handed out, but were unable to turn up any potential suspects. Since it does not sound like he worked in a high crime area, I don't get the impression that Johnny was involved in any major cases during his career that involved murder, drugs, or violence. Hell, I already shared this story about how Johnny once pulled over a guy for DUI and decided to drive him home rather than arrest him, so following Johnny's death, he decided to purchase his family's home to repay the favor. You're not going to find that many law enforcement officers who commanded that level of respect, which makes me all the more curious about what a guy like Johnny could have done to compel someone to murder him in such a violent rage. This is why I'd love to learn more details about his relationship with Perry Worrell and why investigators believe that things went so horribly wrong with two men who were once best friends. Without knowing more, I won't go so far as to brand Perry as the killer. Now, when the crime originally took place, DNA profiling was not yet a tool in criminal investigations, but in 2012, it was announced that DNA testing was going to be performed on some of the evidence. Given that Johnny was stabbed 42 times, and a number of items were collected from the scene, such as the wig, aviator glasses, and the hard hat, there's a decent chance that the killer left their DNA somewhere. Law enforcement was vague on what sort of forensic testing has been performed, but they did say they were able to eliminate some persons of interest, though they never specified if one of them might have been Perry Worrell. In recent years, I have not seen any mention of the possibility of using genetic genealogy, but if Perry was the killer, this process would allow law enforcement to posthumously link him to the crime, or alternatively, eliminate him as a suspect if the DNA does not match. However, investigators have never stopped sending out public pleas for people to come forward if they have information, which suggests to me that they may not have an adequate amount of physical evidence to make an arrest or close this case unless it can be corroborated. Overall, this case is a major head-scratcher, and while it was hard enough to figure out what happened with the official version of events that was shared, learning that story might not even be true only confuses the issue even more. All I know for certain is that Johnny Bowman was a beloved individual whose loss devastated a great number of people, and since there was a major push to solve his murder, I'm guessing that no one expected it would still be unsolved over 40 years later. But I would love to see Nikki and everyone else who cared about Johnny finally receive justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Johnny Bowman, please contact the Virginia State Police at 703-803-2676. That's 703-803-2676. Or you can call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That's 1-800-225-5324. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.werder@icloud.com. That's robin.werder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a triple homicide known as the Leathers Oil Company murders, which took place back in 1994, but even though 2 of the individuals involved in the crime were caught and convicted, the alleged mastermind, Tyrone Thies, has never been found and has remained a wanted fugitive for the past 3 decades. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1930 disappearance of an abducted 2-year-old infant named Mary Agnes Maroney. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I also wanted to announce that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get 20% off. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.